What are the problems with the CPI? This is what we will see in this video. The consumer price index, as we know, is an average of the basket of goods that is consumed by a typical household over a period of time, so that's over a year, and then it is compared to the previous years. We saw the calculation in the last episode, but it has several issues because of the fact that it is an average measure. So what does that mean? First and foremost, the number one drawback is because it's an average measure, it means it is not really representative. It leaves out many stakeholders of the society and doesn't represent everyone. So for instance, a typical household will be very different in their cost of living and in their expenditures and spending habits than, say, someone like a pensioner or a full-time university student or an expat with or without a family. All of them will be very different from each other in their spending habits and how and what they spend on. So obviously there will be very different rates of inflation for different income earners and atypical households. So atypical households are not the typical ones like the pensioners or the students or expats, etc. Right? And secondly, different income earners. Now there can be high income earners and low income earners. So the same rules do not apply to both of them. So for high income earners or wealthy individuals, the pinch of the inflation would be very different than for low income earners. And that brings us to the second problem. The percentage of income spent is not accounted for. Now these are two separate points because in this also you're not looking at how different it is for different income earners and what their needs are. That's not typically represented in the CPI because the basket is just taking an average. So the spending of one household may be very, very different from the spending of another household, but you're just taking that average value and reporting it as the inflation rate or the consumer price index of the country. What this means is that, let's say for instance, we have a household which is spending on, say, petrol as well as bread. Now for petrol, they would typically need to fill their tank, fill their car. Maybe they are filling it twice a month, right? So the weight given while calculating the CPI is 2 because that's how many times or the frequency with which they are filling up. Whereas for something like bread, for instance, or flour, they would be buying it maybe 8 times a month. So which means that the weight assigned to bread is higher. However, we know that petrol and bread in terms of their prices are so vastly different. And that percentage of income spent, where a person would be spending more percentage of their income for petrol rather than bread, that is simply not accounted for when calculating CPI, which makes it a really strange way of looking at or calculating the consumer price index. That is the second problem. The third problem is the consumption pattern changes, right? So over time, consumption patterns change and people make different substitutions for what they're using based on, let's say, relative price changes, for instance, or they found something better. So that consumption pattern will change, and that may not be accounted for, or it may be difficult to compare this over time because of that pattern spending changing. That should be accounted for in the CPI for it to be truly representative. Newer products is the fourth limitation. So newer products, let's say Netflix as opposed to DVDs, right? So if the CPI is consistently going to look at DVDs only, there would be a point of time when the weight assigned to it would be 0. Maybe a typical household has now completely shifted to Netflix and they won't buy DVDs anymore because they have become obsolete, or the need for it has gone. It's pretty redundant. So if that is not representative in the CPI, then if that is not taken into account, then the CPI is not going to be representative at all. It's going to overstate or understate the inflation. Now, over time, there can be limited comparability. This is for the same reason like we saw earlier. So if newer products are introduced and now you're looking at inflation in say 1970 compared to today, it will be very difficult to compare it because the products are so vastly different. If they are vastly different, it means the purchasing will be so different. The spending habits on them will be very different depending on lifestyle and culture and all of those things. And all that diversity is not seen over here. Another drawback is time lags, because inflation is, the CPI is calculated looking at the consumption of the typical household for all the goods and services. Now that can be very tedious, to look at in actual terms. It might not be as simple as we are looking at it, and the actual number of items used will be so many, and every small and big item used is tried to be taken into account when calculating CPI, which means that there would be a time lag between the data which has actually been used for calculation and the published final result. So that time lag would also not be accounted for and could lead to a misleading CPI and inflation rate. And lastly, international comparisons and regional comparisons become very difficult. So let's say we are taking the region of Southeast Asia, right? Within Southeast Asia, the cost of housing in, let's say, Hong Kong or Singapore versus the cost of housing in Thailand is very different. Houses in Thailand you can get for all prices, whereas in Hong Kong or Singapore, they have typically high housing rates. So those comparisons will be very difficult. If you want to compare it with some European countries, or you want to compare it with Scotland, again, it will be very difficult to compare because of the vastly different cost of living. It's also difficult to compare regionally or within a country because the city areas have different prices as compared to the rural areas, right? A business area, business district will be very different from a rural district. So again, you are seeing this, difference, which then you're just taking an average and how representative it is really of that country. So households are left out, areas are left out, and that representation is not there because the fact is you're taking an average. You can't look at each and every stakeholder, you can't look at each and every different household and account for all those differences. There are cultural differences, there are economic differences, and the diversity is so much that it's very difficult for CPI to be a truly representative measure. So these are some of the problems with CPI. There are about 7 here, and they should be enough for you to write down a good essay question based on this. And we'll go deeper into inflation and deflation in the next video. Thank you.